Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing big summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Usually, when we talk about urban development or city planning, there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Right, like it's a hard science or something.
Exactly. It just feels like engineering. You look at a map, you identify an economically depressed area, you secure your funding, build a community center, and then you just sort of expect measurable, predictable results.
Yeah, it's a very analytical approach. It's a very clean way to look at the world, honestly. Problem, solution, broken, fixed.
Totally.
I mean, we naturally gravitate toward models that can be neatly categorized into grant proposals or, spreadsheets and quarterly reports. It gives us this illusion of total control over incredibly complex human problems.
But then, and this is what we're really digging into today, you step into the reality of a late 19th century Skid Row.
Oh, yeah.
You step into a realm that's entirely defined by severe, untreated addiction, deep historical trauma, and just total, utter destitution. Suddenly, that clean engineering approach just shatters.
It completely falls apart.
Right.
Yeah.
We're looking at a landscape of human suffering that is, it's murky. It's the absolute definition of muddy waters. And so the question becomes, what happens when you throw your spreadsheets into the most notorious murderous slum west of New York City?
That is the perfect setup for what we're looking at today.
So today we are opening up a really fascinating historical text for this deep dive. It's a book called The Old Lighthouse, The Story of the Pacific Garden Mission by James R. Adair. And we're going to see how an 1877 mission basically threw out the rule book and replaced social science with this radical street-level methodology.
Yeah, and before we really get into the weeds, I think we need to set a quick framework for you, the listener, because to really understand this book, we have to look at it through the lens of its authors and its subjects.
Right, their worldview.
Exactly. They didn't view addiction or poverty strictly as, like, a chemical imbalance or an economic failure. They viewed it through a deeply theological lens. We're talking about concepts of sin, grace, and evangelical salvation.
And just to be super clear, our goal today isn't to preach that specific theology. We're here to impartially reverse engineer it.
Right.
We want to understand how that specific worldview and this absolute unshakable belief in concepts like redemption and divine intervention actually built an institution that survived for nearly a century.
Yeah, we're examining the mechanics of how that belief, when you combine it with radical empathy, scaled up into the second oldest rescue mission in the United States.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We are traveling back in time to an era and a place that is honestly almost hard to comprehend today. Imagine a stretch of late 19th century Chicago. This is South Clark Street.
Locally known as the Levee.
The Levee.
All right.
And it was so thoroughly entrenched in vice that it operated almost as an autonomous zone of chaos. I mean, we are talking wall-to-wall gambling halls, brothels, opium dens, and saloons.
And you really have to contextualize what created that specific environment. It didn't just pop up out of nowhere. In 1871, you had the Great Chicago Fire.
Which was just devastating.
Utterly devastating. It completely wiped out the city's infrastructure. And that catastrophe physically reshaped the demographics of Chicago. It pushed the majority of the respectable churches, the civic institutions, the wealthy residents. It pushed them all out to the fringes of the city.
Just trying to escape the literal ashes.
Exactly. They were attempting to flee the destruction and rebuild their lives in safer, more stable zones.
Leaving this massive void right in the center of the city.
A total moral and institutional vacuum. When you strip away the stabilizing institutions from a downtown area, and then you combine that absence with the raw, unchecked, brutal industrial growth of post-fire Chicago, you get the Levee.
Wow.
Yeah, it became this gravity well for the displaced, a place where people went when they had absolutely nowhere else to go, or honestly, when they actively wanted to disappear into their darkest impulses.
So into this specific, incredibly dangerous void steps a woman named Sarah Clark. Now, she and her husband, Colonel George Clark, they're wealthy.
Very wealthy.
Right. He is a Civil War veteran, actually rose to lieutenant colonel with the 13th Illinois Volunteers, and he's become this highly successful real estate man.
Yeah.
And while he's out west in Colorado, trying to close these lucrative real estate deals that promise even more substantial profit for their comfortable lifestyle, Sarah is doing something completely counterintuitive. She is walking the streets of Chicago's slums.
The contrast there is just vital to understanding their motivation. You have a husband whose professional life is focused entirely on upward mobility.
Right, wealth generation.
Yeah, he's capitalizing on Western expansion, looking at boom towns, plotting out capital. Meanwhile, his wife's entire focus is being pulled violently downward. Sarah is physically walking into the absolute gutter of society.
Just by herself.
Yeah, she's visiting the poor, she's starting this little mission Sunday school, and she begins praying with incredible intensity about starting a permanent mission, specifically targeting the drunkards and derelicts along the levee.
And what's wild is that her downward pull actually overrides his upward mobility.
Yeah.
Like, Colonel Clark eventually abandons the Colorado real estate deal. Drops it entirely. The text says he physically gets on his knees, prays, and decides to pivot his entire life's trajectory. So they rent a small room capable of holding maybe 40 people right next door to a notorious saloon called Hinky Dinks.
Great name, terrible place.
Truly. But in 1880, Colonel Clark's real estate instincts kind of kick back in. He realizes 40 people isn't enough. They need more space. But this time, those instincts are consecrated for this new mission. He goes hunting for larger quarters on this incredibly dangerous street.
And he finds this building that had recently been vacated by the infamous Pacific Beer Garden.
Which is such an ironic name for a place on Skid Row.
Right. And the naming of the new institution is just, it's a masterclass in 19th century branding. They actually consult with Dwight L. Moody, who was this wildly famous evangelist of the era.
Huge name at the time.
Huge. And Moody essentially looks at the building's history and tells them, just strike out the word beer and add the word mission.
Just swap the words.
That's it. Thus, the Pacific Garden Mission is born.
I look at this and I honestly can't help but think of it as a sort of, well, like spiritual gentrification.
Oh, that's an interesting phrase.
Right, because you take the absolute most corrupted, notorious piece of real estate in the city, a place entirely synonymous with vice, and you flip its purpose completely. You keep the brand recognition of the Pacific Garden, but instead of serving cheap beer that keeps men trapped on Skid Row, you're serving a message designed to pull them out of it.
That concept of spiritual gentrification is a really brilliant way to frame it. But I think it's important to note how it differs from, modern urban gentrification.
How so?
Well, today, gentrification usually involves pushing vulnerable populations out of an area so the wealthy can move in and enjoy it. The Clarks did the exact inverse. They brought themselves, their wealth, their status, into the danger zone specifically to serve the people who were already there.
See.
They weren't trying to displace the patrons of the brothels and the opium dens. They were actively opening their doors to them.
Okay, wait, hold on. Let's look at this from a practical, street-level standpoint. You have two wealthy, upper-class people from the polite society of 1800s Chicago.
Right.
How does this actually work without them getting completely chewed up by the environment? I mean, if two socialites walked into a modern-day drug den in tailored suits and started talking, they wouldn't just be ignored, they'd be targeted. How did the Clarks survive the levee, let alone influence it?
That is the core question, and the text gives us a very clear answer. It comes down to absolute, unrelenting presence and the total surrender of their previous lifestyle.
Well, surrender.
Yeah, they did not practice what we would call armchair philanthropy today.
Right, they weren't just writing checks.
Exactly. They didn't establish an endowment from a safe distance and hire a staff of hardened locals to do the dirty work. Colonel Clark is described as literally holding the fort. He preached night after night in that room, even when the crowd was noisy, restless, and deeply chaotic.
And the book does not sugarcoat that crowd at all. It was a volatile mix of drunks, dope addicts, harlots, and thieves. The author actually notes it was so chaotic that establishing order, which they called heaven's first law, required the wisdom of Solomon just to separate the drunken men and physically keep them from fighting during the services.
It was a rough crowd. And while the colonel was attempting to hold the room's attention from the front, Sarah, who eventually became known to everyone on the levee as Mother Clark, she was physically wading into the crowds.
Wow, she didn't stay on the stage?
No, she didn't stay elevated on a platform. She moved among the audience, speaking to them one-on-one. And she didn't just stay in the mission building either. She went to the county hospitals, the jails, the absolute deepest, darkest trenches of human misery in Chicago, and they bankrolled this entire operation by completely liquidating their own lifestyle.
The financial aspect of this early phase is just wild to read about. Their personal income dropped massively because the colonel essentially gave up his real estate business to run the mission full-time. So they were constantly struggling to keep the doors open.
Right, and their response to that financial crisis is incredibly revealing about their worldview. Instead of scaling back the operations of the mission to match their dwindling bank account, they scaled back themselves.
Like personally.
Yes. The book describes this incredible moment of conviction regarding what they called the indulgences of former years.
Oh, this part is amazing.
Yeah, they gathered up literally every piece of jewelry they owned, all their diamonds, even items they considered sacred presents, and they sold them all to fund the mission. Mother Clark would routinely write personal checks to keep the lights on and the rent paid until her bank book was entirely empty.
And when the bank book finally hit zero, the source material recounts this literal miracle of provisions. I mean, they were entirely out of funds. They prayed intensely about it, and the next morning they walked outside to find their home garden completely covered in an out-of-season crop of mushrooms.
Which is just bizarre.
It's totally bizarre. The book notes they had never seen mushrooms grow there before, and they never saw them grow there again. But they gathered them up, took them downtown to the famous Palmer House Hotel, and sold them for enough income to replace the previous night's expenditures at the mission.
And, whether a modern reader views that event through a lens of literal divine intervention or just a wildly serendipitous biological anomaly, the psychological and operational effect on the Clarks was exactly the same.
It gave them fuel.
It galvanized their absolute faith. It armored them against discouragement. I mean, when you believe the universe, or God, is literally growing currency in your backyard to fund your work, you do not quit when the work gets difficult.
We really don't. So the Clarks are the catalysts. They bring the initial capital, they have the real estate savvy to secure the location, and they provide this foundational surge of faith.
Right.
But wealthy founders eventually pass away. Colonel Clark died in 1892 and Mother Clark in 1918. Now, in the nonprofit world today, a transition of leadership away from heavily invested, wealthy founders usually spells disaster.
Almost always. The funding dries up, the vision gets diluted, and the doors eventually close.
So how did the Pacific Garden Mission not just survive their deaths, but actually expand?
Well, this is where the sociological brilliance of the Pacific Garden Mission really reveals itself. When it came time to establish the next generation of leadership, they didn't go out to prestigious seminaries to recruit polished theologians.
No board searches.
Nope. They didn't headhunt executives from Ivy League universities. They cultivated their leadership from their own crop of what the book bluntly calls human wrecks. They built a lineage of the rescued. The very people who stumbled into the mission looking for a handout eventually became the ones running the entire operation.
Which brings us to Harry Monroe. We really have to talk about his story because it literally feels like a scene from a movie.
Harry Monroe's arrival at the mission is a perfect study in the margins of fiction and desperation. So, the year is 1880. Monroe is this thick-set, tough guy who has just been released by a federal judge in Detroit after facing a really serious counterfeiting charge.
Although he's hardened.
Very. He leaves Detroit, hits Chicago, and walks straight into a saloon on the levee. He orders a massive schooner of beer, he lifts the glass to his lips, and right at that precipice, a thought hits him with absolute clarity. The text says he thought, if I drink this, I'm right back where I was.
Oh man, it's the ultimate precipice of relapse. It's a moment that anyone who has ever battled addiction or loves someone battling addiction understands intimately.
It's exactly.
It's the physical weight of the habit pulling you in one direction and the terrifying knowledge of what that habit costs pulling you in the other.
And in that moment, Monroe physically shoves the glass back toward the bartender. He walks out of the saloon and into the chaotic street, and through the noise of the levee, he hears music. It's the wheezy organ and the off-key singing coming from the Pacific Garden Mission.
Wow.
He pushes open the door, stands in the back of the room in this sage green suit, and that very night, he surrenders his life to the mission. That former counterfeiter, a man who hours earlier was a hair's breadth from sliding back into the criminal underworld, eventually becomes the superintendent of the entire mission after Colonel Clark passes away.
Let's break down the mechanics of why that specific leadership choice works so well on Skid Row. Because why is a former counterfeiter more effective in this environment than, say, a polished, wealthy philanthropist?
It fundamentally comes down to the psychology of peer-to-peer rescue. When Harry Monroe took over the preaching and the daily operations, the destitute men walking through those doors weren't being lectured by a wealthy real estate magnate anymore.
Right, the dynamic shifted entirely.
Exactly. They were being guided by a man who had occupied the exact same bar stools, a man who had stood before the exact same federal judges. It completely strips away the barrier of judgment. I mean, When a man in the throes of alcohol withdrawal looks at the superintendent of the mission and knows that the superintendent fundamentally understands the physical agony he is in, trust is established almost instantaneously.
And Monroe leveraged that string credibility brilliantly.
Yeah.
He was this man's man, round-faced, physically imposing. The book notes that small-time hoodlums would come into the mission just to look at him.
Yeah.
They respected him so much that they would actually confide in him about robberies or jobs they were actively planning to pull. And Monroe would sit with them and literally plead with them not to commit the crime. He spoke their language.
He met them where they were.
Yes. But he didn't just wait for them to come to him. He was incredibly innovative. He realized that a lot of the guys on the street were too intimidated or just too deeply entrenched in the saloons to even walk through the doors of a building labeled Mission.
So Monroe's solution to that intimidation was the gospel wagon.
I love this part.
It's brilliant. He created this horse-drawn wagon equipped with seating and a musical instrument, and they would drive it straight into the absolute worst, most dangerous streets of Chicago. They brought the preaching, the personal testimonies, and the music directly to the people. Basically, if the men wouldn't come to the triage center, Monroe took the triage center to the men.
And that mobile strategy really paid off.
Mm-hmm.
Under Monroe's leadership, the mission reaches another crucial figure in 1897, a man named Mel Trotter. Trotter was an alcoholic whose life was in absolute ruins, but he was saved under Monroe's preaching.
Right.
And Trotter was so deeply impacted by the methodology of the Pacific Garden Mission that he went on to become this massive multiplier. He founded 60 distinct rescue missions across the country.
60? That's unbelievable scale.
60. And he eventually returned to serve as the general superintendent of the Pacific Garden Mission from 1912 to 1918.
And Trotter's tenure brings the mission right to the threshold of the Roaring Twenties. We really have to consider the cultural environment of Chicago during this era.
Oh yeah, Capone.
Exactly. This is the era of Prohibition. It's the era of speakeasies, rampant bootlegging, and the explosion of organized crime. The vice didn't disappear. It just became wildly profitable and incredibly violent. And who is running the mission during this chaotic, dangerous time? A husband and wife team handpicked by Mel Trotter, Pye and Mal Taylor.
The Taylors have this fascinating, almost theatrical dynamic. Pye Taylor had this booming foghorn voice. The book specifically notes that his voice could literally stop a wandering derelict dead in his tracks on the street and compel him to turn toward the open doors of the mission.
He just commanded attention.
Totally. And while Pye was booming away from the front, Mal Taylor was sitting at the piano, constantly playing and praying.
And Ma Taylor's presence at that piano is responsible for one of the most famous pieces of art to come out of this era of the mission's history. She wrote the famous hymn, Calvary Covers It All.
But the origin story of that song isn't just a moment of musical inspiration, is it?
No, it's a perfect encapsulation of the social and economic hurdles these rescued men faced. We should look closely at the story of Charles E. Crawford.
Yeah, tell us about Crawford.
So Charles Crawford was a convert at the mission. He gets clean, he gets his life together, and he actually manages to land a very respectable job working for the American Bible Society. But right as he's establishing this new life, he hits a terrifying administrative wall. His district manager informs him that he has to be bonded for the job.
Just for context for you listening, in the business and financial world, being bonded is essentially an insurance policy against employee theft or fraud. Securing a bond requires a pristine, deeply thorough background check. The bonding company is taking on financial risk based on the employee's history of trustworthiness.
Right. And Crawford's history was the exact opposite of trustworthy. His record before his conversion at the mission was described as being black as midnight.
Wow.
He had a dark, extensive criminal past. He knew instantly that no bonding company on earth would ever take the financial risk on a guy with his rap sheet. He was absolutely heartbroken. He goes down to the shipping room, assumes he's going to lose his livelihood, and starts praying in sheer desperation.
But the outcome defies standard corporate logic. The governing board of the Bible Society didn't just look at a piece of paper. They reviewed his actual case. They reviewed the tangible evidence of his complete behavioral transformation since arriving at the mission.
Which is unheard of.
Truly. And miraculously, the board voted to waive the strict bonding rule entirely. They didn't just allow him to keep the job. They actually increased his salary.
And when Crawford comes back to the mission to testify about this, he's just booming out his relief to the room, saying that Calvary covers it all. Ma Taylor is sitting right there at the piano. She internalizes that immense relief, the grace, and the sheer impossibility of his story and she pens the hymn right on the spot.
It's such a powerful story, but it also really highlights the systemic barriers. Even when a man transforms internally, society's external rules like bonding requirements are designed to keep him trapped in his past. The mission wasn't just fighting addiction, it was fighting the stigma that society permanently attaches to the addicted.
Yeah, so that legacy of transformed lives basically becomes their endowment. Their survival is entirely dependent on the changed behavior of their converts. But keeping a small storefront running with a few dedicated volunteers is one thing.
Right.
As the 20th century rolls in, Chicago is exploding in population. The Great Depression hits, and the sheer volume of human need just skyrockets. The mission has to scale up massively.
So how do they handle that physical, logistical strain without losing that intensely personal, individual touch?
Well, they needed someone with an almost engineering-like mind for logistics, combined with an absolute zealot's passion for the core mission. And they found that exact combination in a man named Harry George Saulnier.
Okay, Harry Saulnier.
Yeah, he officially took over as the keeper of the Old Lighthouse on March 1st, 1940. Saulnier was this physically imposing figure, 6 feet 3 inches tall, and he gave absolutely 100% of his physical and mental energy to the mission, day and night.
Let's look at the sheer scale of the operations under Saulnier, because this is the point where the Pacific Garden Mission stops looking like a small storefront church and starts operating like a small, highly efficient municipality.
Oh, completely.
I mean, we are talking about preparing and serving 600 meals a day. We're talking about making 285 beds daily for Skid Row men, returning GIs, destitute women, and entire families who had lost everything.
And we really have to examine how Saulnier managed those facilities, because this wasn't a matter of just throwing a dirty cot in a corner and calling it charity. The text specifically emphasizes that Saulnier demanded the 4 buildings comprising the mission be kept spick and span.
Why the intense focus on cleanliness? I mean, if a guy is freezing to death on the street, wouldn't he just be happy to be indoors, regardless of the dust?
It's a fair question, but Saulnier intimately understood the psychology of dignity. Many government-run poorhouses or municipal shelters of that era were bleak, filthy, and dehumanizing.
Right, just awful conditions.
Exactly. They treated the poor like a nuisance to be warehoused.
Yeah.
Saulnier understood that order, cleanliness, and physical dignity are prerequisites for someone who feels entirely discarded by society to begin feeling human again. When a man walks out of a filthy alley and into a gleaming, spotless environment where he is handed a clean set of sheets, it communicates value. It tells him, without a word being spoken, that he is worth the effort of cleanliness.
And Saulnier was a master at communicating that value to the outside world, too. He understood branding on a massive scale. He's the one who erected the iconic 35-foot neon sign memorializing Paul Taylor.
Oh, the sign.
This thing towered 4 stories above the sidewalk.
Yeah.
In massive, glowing red neon letters, it proclaimed, "Christ died for our sins and Jesus saves."
And let's break down the sheer economics of that sign in the 1940s, because it cost $3,500 to erect initially. That is a massive capital expenditure for a charity back then.
Huge.
And the monthly upkeep alone was $78. That broke down to $48 for routine maintenance and $30 just for the electricity to keep those red neon tubes glowing all night long. In an organization where every dollar could be spent on soup or blankets, dedicating that much of the budget to a glowing sign is a profound strategic choice.
But the strategy paid off. It acted as a literal and metaphorical lighthouse. The book mentions a specific incident in late 1947 involving an ex-newspaper reporter. He was standing on the street, mentally broken, literally contemplating suicide. He looks up, sees the glowing words, "Jesus saves," cutting through the Chicago night, stops his plan, walks into the mission, and finds hope.
Wow.
The sign physically intercepted a suicide.
And Saulnier believed in intercepting people wherever they were. The book paints this vivid picture of a man who was relentlessly, almost obsessively passing out gospel tracts. He genuinely believed that no Christian was fully dressed unless they had tracts in their pockets ready to distribute.
He had zero regard for social norms or the awkwardness of approaching strangers. The author, James Adair, tells a story about going out to dinner with Saulnier at the Dearborn Street station. As they're walking, Saulnier would just abruptly drop back or turn aside to hand a tract to a complete stranger, saying cheerfully, "Here's good news, a calendar for your wallet, sir." He did this on busy train platforms. He did it on commercial airplanes.
The most incredible example is when he was on vacation at a ski resort in Banff, Alberta.
Wait, really? On a ski lift?
Yes. He was riding the ski lift up the mountain, and he was leaning over to hand tracks to the people riding the lift down the mountain.
That is hilarious.
It's wild, but it shows a mind that never, ever clocked out. For Saunier, every single human interaction, no matter how brief or mundane, was an opportunity for high-stakes spiritual triage.
But practically speaking, to feed 600 people a day, you need a serious supply chain. And Saunier built one that was entirely fueled by volunteer faith. It wasn't just him passing out papers in Chicago. He had guys like Carl Driesman out in the Midwest.
Tell us about Driesman.
Well, Driesman was an Iowa tractor dealer, just a big burly guy who flew his own private plane, and he essentially acted as a regional logistics coordinator, organizing farmers across the entire Midwest to collect massive shipments of food, grain, and usable clothing.
And once Driesman gathered the supplies, another volunteer named Cornelius Pals, who was a professional trucker, would coordinate and personally pay for the shipping of all those goods straight to the Pacific Garden Mission.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a sophisticated interstate supply chain operating entirely outside the traditional corporate or government structures.
Okay, let's pause here because this is where a modern secular observer might interject. We're looking at a highly efficient organization providing 600 meals a day, giving people clean beds, sourcing clothes from Iowa farmers, and maintaining massive facilities.
Right.
Isn't this just a very successful, highly organized social service operation? Like, why pouch all this practical, life-saving aid and all the heavy religious terminology? Why not just be a great humanitarian shelter?
That is the exact tension that Harry Saunier addressed head-on. He was strictly, adamantly opposed to viewing the mission as mere humanitarian aid. Oh yeah, he's actually quoted in the text saying, "Except for the souls the Lord of the harvest so graciously gives, Pacific Garden Mission would be merely another social service organization." For Saunier, the food, the clean sheets, the sweeping of the floors, all of it was strictly a means to an end.
So you feed the stomach so the ear will listen. You warm the body so the mind can process the message.
Precisely. It aligns with basic human psychology and the hierarchy of needs. If a man is freezing, starving, and covered in his own filth, his brain is in full survival mode. His physical panic prevents him from engaging with abstract, high-level concepts like grace, redemption, or existential purpose.
That makes total sense.
Saunier understood that by providing a hot meal and a clean bed without any preconditions, the mission was proving its love in a tangible physical way. Once that physical panic is momentarily alleviated by the hot soup, the spiritual receptivity opens up. The goal of the Pacific Garden Mission was never just to keep a man alive on Skid Row. The goal was to get him off Skid Row permanently by fundamentally changing his internal identity.
And the proof that this philosophy worked lies in the actual lives it changed. The book dedicates significant time to what it calls the trophies of grace, because you can talk about the infrastructure, the neon signs, the supply chains, and the 600 meals all day long. But the entire massive system was designed for the individual. Let's look at the actual case studies.
Yeah, the demographics of the ruined lives that walk through those doors are staggering in their diversity. It shatters the stereotype of who ends up on Skid Row.
Totally.
The mission didn't just see the stereotypical vagrant. They saw disgraced medical doctors, ruined corporate executives, runaway teenage farm boys, and victims of human trafficking. The mission proved daily that ruin does not discriminate by class or education.
Let's start with a guy who became a literal household name in America, Billy Sunday. Long before he was known worldwide as a massive evangelist, he was a professional baseball player for the Chicago White Stockings.
That's right.
He was walking down the street with his teammates, enjoying the status of a professional athlete, when he heard the mission group singing on the corner. He felt an intense pull to go inside, but he was terrified. He later admitted he was afraid of the horse laugh the boys would give him if they found out a pro ball player was going to a Skid Row mission.
And the cultural weight of professional baseball in the late 19th century was immense. Sunday was facing intense peer pressure at the highest level of sports society. Going into a mission meant associating with the absolute bottom rung of the social ladder. He was legitimately afraid of losing his status and becoming a joke in the locker room.
But the internal pull was stronger than the external pressure. He went inside. And the way he describes the physical space of the old mission building is so visceral. He remembered the exact dark and stormy night. He said he could walk into that building and show you the specific dark knothole in the wooden floorboard that he knelt on when he publicly accepted salvation.
The text notes that his transformation was immediate, but it's crucial to understand that it didn't magically remove the worldly pressures of his career. Right.
It simply reframed how he handled them. The author notes that in his very first game as a new Christian, the pressure was immense. He had to hold a tight 3-2 lead in the ninth inning. But Sunday reported that the inner turmoil, the crippling anxiety of performance and status, was completely gone.
And Billy Sunday never forgot the exact coordinates of where his life changed. Years later, after he had left baseball and become a massive nationwide evangelistic phenomenon, he was closing a grueling 10-week campaign in Chicago. He decided to give a love offering to the Pacific Garden Mission. Do you know how much this former ballplayer wrote a check for?
I do, and it's staggering.
$42,000.
In 1923 dollars. That is an astronomical sum of money.
It paid for 2/3 of the total cost of moving the mission out of its old, cramped quarters and into its massive new facility on South State Street. He literally bought the physical foundation of their future.
That's incredible.
But as flashy as Billy Sunday's story is, you have stories that are much quieter, much grittier, but no less profound. Let's talk about Ben Engstrom. Ben Engstrom's story is a beautiful illustration of Harry Saunier's nuanced psychological approach to the individuals who came in. Ben was a severely alcoholic, former electrical foreman. He had lost his career, his standing, and everything else to the bottle.
Just completely lost everything.
Yeah, he was drooping, hopeless, entirely defeated. When he came into the mission, Saunier didn't just stand behind a pulpit and shout theology at him. He walked over and put a compassionate, physical arm around him.
And the key detail the book highlights here is electricity. The text explicitly points out that the fact that Saunier knew something about electricity gave Ben a feeling of deep kinship. It was a shared language. Saunier wasn't just some holy man living in the clouds. He was a practical guy who understood watts, currents, and wiring.
That shared technical language broke down the defensive barrier that Ben had built up. But Ben's story isn't a neat, linear fairy tale where he prays once and everything is perfect forever.
No, it's not.
He prayed with Saunier, but the text honestly states that nothing happened. The internal switch didn't flip. Ben walked out of the mission and went right back to the street. He spent 3 more brutal years wandering Skid Row, begging, borrowing, stealing drinks, fully assuming he would end up freezing to death and being buried in a nameless potter's field.
The reality of relapse is fully acknowledged here. The mission doesn't pretend that failure doesn't happen. But 3 years later, in March of 1945, Ben is wandering around in a foggy, desperate, alcoholic haze. And through that haze, he remembers that big man at the mission who knew about electricity.
He remembered that connection.
Yeah, so he stumbles into a doctor's office, begs for streetcar fare, and manages to make his way back to South State Street. He kneels at the cross again, and this time, the transformation takes hold. He gets a clean bed, he gets clean clothes, and he never touches the bottle again.
And Ben Engstrom didn't just leave and start a new life elsewhere. He stayed at the Old Lighthouse. For 21 years, he served as the chief building engineer for the massive facility.
That is just beautiful.
Think about the poetry of that. The man whose life had completely short-circuited on the levee was now literally keeping the lights on and the radiators hot for the next generation of broken men coming through the doors.
It gives me chills. And it shows how the mission utilized the skills of the people they saved. But not everyone who came in had a career history like an electrical foreman. You have the sheer physical brutality of a story like Jimmy the Rat.
Right, Jimmy's story is so tough. Jimmy was an Indiana farm boy, just a kid who got swept into the city and fell victim to dope at the incredibly young age of 16. He ended up living a literally rat-like existence in a Chicago opium den.
Oh man, 16?
Yeah, the book describes how he actually tried to leave the den once because he heard the mission singing out on the street, but the proprietors of the den dragged him back inside by force.
The physical violence of the levee is fully on display in Jimmy's story. He was eventually beaten completely unconscious with a pile of lumber and dumped in an alley, left for dead by the people he bought dope from.
It was only the shock of the cold rain and the fresh air that revived him. Bleeding, battered, and completely broken, he stumbles out of the alley and into the mission. He is holding up his hands, just begging for someone, anyone, to pray for him.
And then what happens?
And Mother Clark, remember, this is the formerly wealthy real estate wife who used to wear diamonds. She comes down from the platform. She doesn't call for a doctor or policeman first. She kneels right beside this bleeding, filthy, dope-addicted teenager in the dirt, and she puts her hand on his arm.
Wow. That physical touch from a mother figure right in the midst of his absolute lowest moment of agony broke him. Jimmy exchanged his old life right there. He eventually recovered, moved back to his roots in Indiana, got married, and raised a family.
We also see the mission intercepting the grim trajectory of the penal system. Take Arnold Vandermeulen. By the time Arnold was 16 years old, he had the dark distinction of being the youngest boy ever sentenced to the Southern Michigan prison.
The youngest boy ever.
Yeah, he was a hardened, institutionalized alcoholic and criminal while still a teenager.
But the mission reaches him. And what happens when a hardened teenage convict finds redemption? He doesn't just get a normal job and disappear into the suburbs. He becomes a massive multiplier, just like Mel Trotter. Arnold goes on to found 3 of his own independent rescue missions in Grand Rapids, Bristol, and Battle Creek.
This brings up a vital psychological mechanism of the Pacific Garden mission. The text refers to these men as trophies of grace. Think about the impact of that on a new arrival.
Right, like visual proof.
Exactly. When a man shaking from delirium tremens walks through the doors and sees Ben Engstrom, who is now radiant, dignified, with his silver hair and broad shoulders, speaking clearly and kindly, Ben becomes living proof. He isn't a theoretical concept, he is a walking, breathing fact.
It's exactly like spiritual ER triage.
Yeah.
You have this massive waiting room filled with people suffering from wildly different catastrophic injuries. You have the corporate executive dying of alcohol poisoning, the teenager beaten near to death by drug dealers, the desperate farm boy hooked on dope. They're all bleeding out in entirely different ways. But the triage nurses at the mission apply the exact same cure to every single one of them. The gospel message. And the trophies of grace are the cured patients who walk around the waiting room showing the new arrivals that the medicine actually works.
It is the most potent marketing tool the mission possesses. It completely defies the cynical sociological view that these people are permanently broken and beyond repair.
But, and we have to be honest here, the reality of Skid Row isn't always a triumphant happy ending. The forces they are fighting are deeply entrenched and violent. We have to talk about the story of Evelyn. The book solemnly refers to her as the martyr.
Evelyn's story is harrowing, and it really grounds the narrative in the lethal reality of the streets. She was a woman who fell into prostitution. To stifle the crushing guilt and the physical trauma of that life, she turned to heavy drug use, which eventually landed her in the cycle of the police courts.
It's a brutal cycle.
But she found her way to the Pacific Garden mission. She found Christ, she got completely clean, and she escaped that brutal life.
But the criminal underworld does not let go of its assets easily. The man who had originally enticed her into prostitution, her former procurer, tracked her down after she got clean. He cornered her and tried to force her, through intimidation, back into the life of the streets.
And Evelyn, standing in her new identity, refused to yield.
Her exact words to him were, "I'm not my own. I'm bought with a price. I can no longer have anything to do with you."
And he murdered her for it. The author, James Adair, reflects on her death in the text. He asks if it was merely a murder, and he concludes that a far more accurate word is martyrdom. Evelyn consciously chose physical death over returning to the spiritual and physical degradation she had just escaped.
It is a devastating, incredibly sobering reminder of the physical stakes in the levee. This work isn't just about helping people feel a little better emotionally. It is a literal battle of life and death. And Evelyn's tragic, powerful story actually became a major catalyst for the mission to realize they needed to reach far beyond the streets of Chicago. Which brings us to the expansion phase, broadcasting the light.
Right. As the 20th century progressed, the leadership of the Pacific Garden mission realized that the levee wasn't the only place in the world in need of a lighthouse. The darkness, the addiction, the broken families, they were everywhere.
It wasn't just isolated to their block.
No, not at all. The mission had to expand its reach, both physically within Chicago and globally through the new frontiers of media.
Let's look at the physical expansion first. For a long time, Skid Row was viewed mostly as a male-dominated environment. The mission dealt primarily with wandering men, but they eventually opened the Women's and Children's Division, led by formidable women like Grace Vanderplug and later Mrs. Stout.
And the cases they handled in that division were beyond heartrending. They were dealing with the collateral damage of addiction and crime.
Like what?
Well, the book describes a specific night where the police bring in a Puerto Rican family from Chicago's West Side. The mother is mentally retarded, living in unimaginable filth, with garbage strewn everywhere and babies crawling naked on dirty mattresses. Why? Because the father, the sole provider, is in prison serving a 199-year sentence for murder.
Oh my goodness, a 199-year sentence.
Yeah. And the mission steps directly into that catastrophic collapse of the family unit. They didn't just offer a quick prayer. They took the children in, physically cared for them, cleaned them, fed them, and eventually managed to transition them safely to their grandparents. The women's division was constantly dealing with homeless mothers, victims of the burlesque shows and taverns who had been chewed up and spat out, and stranded young wives of sailors whose purses and tickets had been stolen at the train stations.
And speaking of sailors, the outbreak of World War II brings a massive, entirely new demographic pouring into Chicago. In November of 1943, Harry Saulnier looks out and sees all these young men in khaki and blue swarming the city streets. They are transient, they are scared, they are separated from their families, and they are bound for war.
Yeah, there are a ton of them.
The USO was operating a few blocks away, providing entertainment, but Saulnier wanted to offer a specifically Christian alternative. So he opens the GI Center.
And the sheer volume of young men seeking out that environment is astonishing. In the first 2 months alone, nearly 5,000 soldiers, sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen crossed the threshold of the GI Center.
That's incredible volume.
They offer ping pong tables, wholesome libraries of books, a canteen decorated with a welcoming Western motif, and most importantly, they provided older, fatherly, personal workers to just sit and talk with these kids before they shipped off to combat zones from which they might never return.
But Harry Saulnier, the man who hands out religious tracts to strangers on ski lifts in Canada, was never going to be content with reaching only the people who physically walked through his doors in Chicago.
Oh, never.
He looked at the emerging technologies of the mid-20th century, specifically radio and film, and he saw a massive megaphone for the missions methodology.
Saulnier possessed incredible media foresight. He reasoned that if he could somehow dramatize the incredibly visceral, true stories of people like Evelyn the Martyr or Harry Monroe, he could reach these slumbering church people right in the comfort of their own living rooms.
You wanted to weaponize the testimony.
Exactly. He wanted to take the localized, gritty testimony of the rescue mission floor and weaponize it for mass media.
So he pushes the mission into the film industry first. In 1948, he brings a company called Cavalcade Productions into the mission with massive motion picture cameras. They produce narrative films with dramatic titles like Miracle on State Street and Out of the Night.
And the book mentions how surreal it was for the staff parts of the working mission, and the chaotic Skid Row outside became a literal film set.
Oh, there's this incredibly funny anecdote in the book about that.
Yeah, the assistant superintendent.
Yes. Loyal Heiler. He was out on the street trying to secure filming locations and witness to people, and he ends up having to do a forced landing on his baggy trousers on the concrete sidewalk after being ungraciously physically shoved out of a tavern by a burly employee who didn't appreciate the interruption.
Just tossed him right out. But the films were successful, yet the true media juggernaut that Saulnier unleashed was radio. He started small, pitching a 15-minute early morning program.
And the man's stamina was unbelievable. He would work all night managing the mission, sleep for maybe 2 hours on a cot, and then be standing at the radio studio microphone by 7:30 a.m. to broadcast a show called Doorway to Heaven.
That initial grueling morning program eventually evolved into something legendary in the broadcasting world, the Unshackled radio drama.
You've heard of that.
Yeah, this was a stroke of genius. They took the true, gritty, real-life stories of actual PGM converts, dramatized them with professional voice actors, added high-quality sound effects, and broadcast them globally. The book notes that at its height, Unshackled was playing on over 205 radio stations across the United States and was syndicated in 25 foreign countries.
Let's analyze the brilliant strategy behind that specific format. Why pivot to fully produced radio dramas? Why not just broadcast a recording of a good sermon?
Because Saulnier inherently understood the power of narrative. Rattling off statistics about serving 600 meals a day doesn't change a skeptic's mind. It just sounds like a budgetary report.
Right, it's dry.
But hearing the dramatized, visceral, emotional story of a counterfeiter holding a beer glass, or an alcoholic engineer freezing in an alley, or a dope-addicted farm boy finding total redemption, that bypasses the intellectual defenses of the listener and hits directly at the heart. He used the emotional power of radio to convince skeptics worldwide that the old-time religion wasn't some outmoded historical relic. It was an active force that still worked miracles every single day.
And the book actually details how he received pushback from the exact skeptics he was trying to reach. James Adair, the author of the book, mentions receiving a highly critical, sarcastic letter from a man claiming to be an educated intellectual.
Yeah, that letter was scathing.
The man argued that the 20th century is far too complex and filled with vastly different psychological profiles to be helped by what he called an outmoded, culturally determined, heretical old-time religion.
And Adair's response in the text is incredibly telling. He basically says, I wish this man could come down to State Street and personally meet the people who applied this heretical religion to their ruined lives before it was too late.
It is the ultimate, unassailable defense of their work. Look at the tangible results. You can debate theology, sociology, and psychology in a university classroom all day long, but you absolutely cannot argue with the physical fact that Ben Engstrom is no longer drinking himself to death in a frozen alley, but is instead sober, dignified, and fixing the radiators in the building. The transformed life ends the debate.
Which really brings us to the final takeaway of our deep dive into the Old Lighthouse. Let's distill the core lessons from everything we've uncovered today. The Pacific Garden mission didn't just survive the ashes of post-fire Chicago, the violent chaos of the Roaring '20s, and the massive demographic shifts of World War II by historical accident.
Right, it wasn't an accident.
No, they survived through a relentless, uncompromising focus on individual, peer-led transformation.
They managed to marry unwavering, radical faith with incredibly practical, relentless action. They understood the absolute necessity of both. You cannot have the 35-foot neon sign promising salvation without diligently paying the $30 electricity bill every month.
Exactly.
You cannot preach effectively to a freezing, starving man without first doing the grueling logistical work of preparing 600 hot meals a day. They understood that the physical reality and the spiritual reality are inextricably linked when you're operating on Skid Row.
And their entire operational philosophy is perfectly summarized by their unofficial motto, never give up on them. Because the relapse, the failure, the stubbornness, it is all part of the journey. The book spends time lovingly describing these colorful, frustrating old-timers that the mission staff just keeps praying for year after grueling year. Guys like Adair.
Oh, Elmer. Tell them about Elmer.
Elmer is a perfect example of the messy, complicated humanity that the mission embraced rather than rejected. He is described as a small, wiry man who loudly claims to be saved, but he still possesses a massive temper and fights like a wild cat on the streets.
And he uses whatever he can find.
Right. The text literally says he fights with anything he can get his hands on. He uses empty Coke bottles and heavy flower pots, and he's an eccentric inventor. He invented a golf ball retriever made of Swedish steel and wanders around the mission with this long green object, stubbornly insisting on managing his own grand financial affairs, even though they inevitably end in disaster every single time. But they never kick him out.
And then there's Bud Thompson, a 125-pound Tennessean. The book notes that if Bud isn't locked up in the county jail for public drunkenness, he's sleeping at the mission. He went into severe delirium tremens once, hallucinated that he was literally in hell, and in the dream, he pleaded with Chief Saulnia for one more chance.
It's just heartbreaking.
He woke up with a horrible physical gash from a fall during his hallucinations. He keeps failing, he keeps drinking, but he keeps coming back to the mission doors. And every single time he walks through, no matter how many times he has failed before, he is offered that one more chance.
It requires a profound, almost superhuman level of patience to operate that way. As Saulnier famously said when asked why he didn't just ban the repeat offenders, "The Lord is patient with us. Where would we be if that wasn't the case?"
Wow.
The staff of the Pacific Garden mission trained themselves to view every single person, no matter how deeply broken, how violently resistant, or how severely addicted, as a precious entity capable of total, absolute renewal.
We have traveled a long way today, from the chaotic, muddy, murderous streets of 1877 Chicago to the pristine glow of the State Street neon sign. We have seen wealthy real estate moguls sell their personal diamonds to buy soup, and we have seen former counterfeiters drive horse-drawn gospel wagons into the darkest alleys of the city.
We have seen the diagnostic, muddy waters of extreme human suffering met not with a clinical, detached engineering approach, but with a radical, immersive, deeply physical love.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as we close. In our fast-paced, highly structured modern world, we are so incredibly quick to write off the addicted, the chronically homeless, the criminal, and the destitute. We categorize them as lost causes, or we reduce them to mere statistics on a city planner's massive spreadsheet. We desperately want a clean binary X-ray to diagnose a problem that is fundamentally messy and human.
It's true. We want it to be simple.
But what would society actually look like If we adopted the Pacific Garden Mission methodology today, what if we operated our cities on the radical, unyielding belief that absolutely no one, no matter how many times they have relapsed, no matter how far gone they seem to be, is beyond total transformation, if only they are given a safe harbor and a completely new narrative for their life?
It would require stepping out of the clean, comfortable spaces we have built for ourselves and wading directly into the muddy waters, just like the Clarks did when they abandoned their comfortable life to move next door to Hinky Dink's saloon.
It's something to think about the next time you walk past someone that society has completely discarded. Maybe they don't need a perfectly calibrated spreadsheet. Maybe they just need a lighthouse.